globalist is a person that wants the globe to do well, frankly, not caring about our country so much. And you know what? We can't have that. You know, they have a word. It sort of became old-fashioned. It's called a nationalist. And I say, really, we're not supposed to use that word. You know what I am? I'm a nationalist, okay? I'm a nationalist. National. Nothing. Use that word. Use that word.
Okay, so President Trump wants us all to call him a nationalist and not a globalist. I want to break this down for you. Merriam-Webster defines globalism as a national policy of treating the whole world as a proper sphere for political influence. Many Trump backers think globalism is a bad thing. A nationalist believes in nationalism. Encyclopedia Britannica defines it as an ideology based on the premise that the individual's loyalty and devotion to the nation state surpass other individual or group interests. But more importantly, President Trump has a ton of support from white nationalists, and that's a very different thing. Merriam-Webster's definition defines a white nationalist as one of a group of militant whites who espouse white supremacy and advocate enforced racial segregation, also known as racists. And I think Donald Trump knows that. So it's a bit of a dog whistle, perhaps, or maybe it's a signal to white nationalists that he supports their goals. Or was it simply that he's confusing nationalism with patriotism? Patriotism, simply put, is this: love for or devotion to one's country. That's an admirable goal. Or maybe we just take the president at his word. He believes nationalism is an ideology based on the premise that the individual's loyalty and devotion to the nation state surpasses other individual or group interests. That, if you take the president at his word, would explain his trade war, his sense that the U.S. shouldn't police the world, and his call to seal off the southern border, his discussions about limiting legal immigration into the United States. I want to discuss this. I want to know what the president actually means by this, because I would think twice before calling myself a nationalist, particularly in this political environment. Michael McFaul joins me now. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Russia who understands history, world history, Russian history in particular, and the places in which nationalism can be dangerous. It's a different thing than patriotism, Ambassador.
It is. It obviously is. And just a simple test. Just when you say that person is a nationalist, what are the historic figures that pop into your head? And you don't have to answer me right now, but to your viewers, just think about what that word does. To your notion of a dog whistle, who pops in your mind when you hear the word nationalist? And then I think it's very important, the distinction you just made between patriotism and nationalism. You know, in social science and political science, we teach the difference between civic nationalism and ethnic nationalism. Right. And patriotism is about civic nationalism. I have a flag in front of my house right now. I'm a proud American. I want to see America perform well. But an ethnic nationalism divides our country. And when I was listening to the president, I heard him speaking in ethnic terms, not in patriotic terms. And there's one other thing, so forgive me, about globalism. He somehow has a theory that anytime we enter into an international treaty or cooperate with another country, it's against America. And that's just not historically true. We don't sign up for treaties to help the globe. We sign up to treaties and cooperate with other nations to advance American national interests through cooperation rather than through confrontation. So he's just dead wrong about his theory of globalism versus nationalism.
So you could actually be a civic nationalist, you can be a patriot, and you can be a globalist all at the same time.
Of course. Of course. Did Ronald Reagan sign the INF Treaty because he was a globalist? Did Truman and his colleagues sign up for NATO and the IMF and World Bank because they wanted to make the world a better place? No. Did Obama sign the Paris Climate Accords because he was trying to help out the French or the Chinese? No. They were all doing it to advance American national interests. The difference is that all of those leaders, and throughout decades of our history, we thought we could get ahead by cooperation as opposed to going our own way. Let me use a really simple analogy that demonstrates how rules can help us. Think about this. What if in the name of nationalism and going our own way that all Americans just decided, I'm just going to drive on the whatever side of the road I want because I want to be independent of the rules? How absurd would that be? By simply saying we're all going to drive on the right side of the road, it makes you better off and all your citizens better off. That's the basic concept of international institutions. Cooperation to make us win-win outcomes that everybody who signs up is better off.
But there is a movement going out around the world right now, which has repeated itself because we have seen these movements in the 20s. We saw them in the 30s in Europe. We saw them in Rwanda. We saw them in the Balkans. We've seen them all over in which nationalism is equated with a nativism or a populism that is anti-other, that is anti-immigrant, that focuses on economic tribulations and makes people think that if you don't look after yourself and close out the house, others will take your prosperity from you.
That's right, of course. And remember how all that, the 20s and 30s ended very tragically. And remember two things about that. One, it was a period of isolation, right? Pulling in, disengaging. Right. And that was horrible in terms of leading to World War II. But remember also, when you talk in ethnic nationalist terms, in most places in the world, including in the United States of America, you're not uniting the nation, you're actually dividing the nation. And in those other historic examples that you just talked about, promoting nationalism led to civil
Correct.
War and sometimes genocidal civil war.
That is right.
That, to me, is not a patriotic way to move forward for our country.
Michael McFaul, thank you for joining me, as always. Ambassador Michael McFaul is former U.S. ambassador to Russia. Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.